The old car looked like something the junkyard itself had rejected twice before giving up on it completely. Its faded silver paint had peeled into patches of rust. One headlight hung loose like a broken eye, and the front bumper leaned so low it almost scraped the gravel beneath it. It sat alone at the far edge of the liquidation yard, ignored by every serious buyer who had come that morning looking for something salvageable. To most people, it was metal waiting to die. To Ethan Carter, it was the only thing in the lot that made him stop walking. His daughter, Lily, her small hand tucked into his rough fingers, looked up at him with confusion as he stared at the wreck longer than he had looked at any other car that morning. Around them, engines revved, auction numbers were shouted, and men in branded jackets laughed while moving toward trucks and SUVs that still had life left in them. Ethan wore the same dark work jacket he used for late repair shifts. Sleeves, faded boots, dusty, wallet carrying exactly $127 the total left after rent school lunch money, and Lily's asthma medication. He had promised her they would find something cheap enough to move something that could at least get her to school without borrowing rides from neighbors again. But when he crouched near the ruined coupe, he didn't look at the cracked windshield first. He looked beneath the steering column. His eyes narrowed. Vanessa Hale noticed immediately. She stood near the office trailer in sharp heels and a cream-colored blazer, owner of the luxury dealership that had bought this failed lot for inventory clearance, watching the poor customers drift through the leftovers with visible impatience. When Ethan asked quietly, "How much for this one?" she laughed before the clerk even answered, loud enough that nearby buyers turned. That she said, crossing her arms, "You'd spend money on that." More laughter. Someone muttered, "Probably buying scrap by the pound." Ethan stayed calm. Lily pressed closer to him. Vanessa stepped nearer, amused now. "That car isn't worth towing home. But if you really want to waste your money..." She glanced at the clerk. $100, cash, no complaints after. Ethan reached into his pocket immediately. Vanessa's smile widened, expecting hesitation. There was none. He handed over the bills one by one. Lily whispered, "Dad." "Why this one?" Ethan opened the driver's side door carefully. It groaned like something waking from sleep. Then he saw it clearly beneath decades of dust, a tiny engraved symbol burned into the metal beside the ignition, 3 lines crossing a circle. His hand froze, his breathing changed. Because 20 years ago in a garage hidden behind a racetrack, no outsider ever entered. He had seen that exact mark only once on a machine worth more than most houses in the city. The laughter began before Ethan Carter even reached the car. It rolled across the gravel lot in scattered bursts, the kind that came easily when people believed they had already understood someone at first glance and found the conclusion entertaining. The liquidation yard stood on the far edge of town behind a row of chain-link fencing, where repossessed trucks, damaged sedans, flood-soaked vans, and forgotten metal waited under the dry afternoon sun for anyone desperate enough or foolish enough to buy what others had abandoned. Ethan arrived carrying exactly one purpose and exactly one limit. He needed something with 4 wheels that could move his daughter to school before the rain season began, and he had $127 after paying rent, electricity, and Lily's inhaler refill 2 nights earlier. He wore his usual faded work jacket from the repair warehouse, sleeves rolled twice at the wrist because the cuffs had frayed, and boots that still carried grease from the overnight shift he had finished less than 3 hours before. Lily walked beside him, holding his hand, her backpack still on because she had come straight after school, her dark braid falling over one shoulder while she scanned rows of broken vehicles with a child's honest uncertainty. She still believed adults usually knew what they were doing. Ethan wished that were always true. The lot smelled of hot metal, old oil, and dust. Men with dealer badges walked confidently past compact cars and pickup trucks, tapping panels, lifting hoods, dismissing anything that looked expensive to fix. Ethan checked prices silently and moved on every time a number crossed beyond reach. 400, 600, 900, too much. Even the ugliest working sedan stood far outside what he could touch. At the far edge of the yard, half behind a collapsed signpost, sat the silver coupe that looked less like a car and more like something forgotten after surviving an argument with time. One headlight missing hood scratched deep enough to expose dull steel paint cracked like dry skin, one tire nearly flat. Most buyers did not even turn their heads toward it. Ethan almost passed too until sunlight hit the driver's side window at an angle and reflected something strange from inside a steering wheel shape slightly wrong for the body style. He stopped. Lily noticed immediately. "Dad?" she asked. Ethan released her hand and crouched beside the front wheel. Rust, yes. Cheap body repairs, yes. But the front suspension sat lower than factory standard. Not collapsed, intentionally lowered. He leaned closer. Someone had reinforced the inner arch by hand years ago. Not amateur work either. Skilled. Very skilled. "Interesting," he murmured. Lily looked from the car to him. "Interesting." "Good." Before Ethan answered, heels clicked across gravel behind them. Vanessa Hale appeared wearing a cream blazer sharp enough to belong in a dealership showroom rather than this dusty yard, sunglasses pushed onto her headphone in one hand, irritation in every line of her posture. She owned Hale Luxury Imports, the company that had recently purchased this failed liquidation lot after a bankruptcy sale, and she had spent most of the afternoon trying to move inventory fast enough to justify the acquisition. Ethan's clothes posture and attention to the worst car present apparently offended something immediate in her sense of order. "You're not seriously looking at that," she said. Ethan straightened slowly. "How much?" Vanessa laughed before the nearby clerk could answer. Two men inspecting a truck nearby turned to watch. "That thing," she repeated. "It barely qualifies as transport." The clerk checked a clipboard. $100. As is. Vanessa folded her arms. "Honestly, if you can get it off the lot without it splitting in half, I should charge less." More laughter from the men nearby. Lily shifted closer to Ethan. He noticed the movement without looking down. One of the buyers lifted his phone as if already amused enough to record. Vanessa tilted her head, studying Ethan with polished disbelief. "You buying scrap for art?" Ethan kept his voice calm. "Just asking the price." Then I answered. She looked at Lily briefly, then back at him. "There are bicycles that make more financial sense." Another man snorted. Ethan reached into his pocket and removed folded bills, counted them carefully, then handed $100 to the clerk. The laughter changed shape, now less mockery, more fascination, that he was actually doing it. Vanessa's smile sharpened. "No refunds when it dies before the gate." Lily looked up at her father. "Dad? Really?" Ethan signed the paper without hurry. "Really." Vanessa stepped aside, dramatically gesturing toward the car like presenting a joke to an audience. "Then congratulations. Worst purchase today." Ethan opened the driver's side door. It groaned but opened fully. Inside smelled like trapped dust and old leather. The steering wheel caught his attention immediately. Wrong stitching pattern. Wrong material. Too narrow for the visible model. He touched it once, lightly. Under the cracked dashboard, he saw fresh screws mixed with older hardware, a mismatch impossible if the interior had remained untouched. Someone had opened this car repeatedly over decades. "Need help towing your treasure?" Vanessa asked. Ethan ignored the tone and checked the gear lever. Manual transmission. Good. Maybe better than expected. He turned the key already hanging there. Nothing happened at first, then a weak electrical click. He tried again. Silence. The men nearby laughed again, louder now because failure had arrived exactly where expected. Vanessa shook her head as if proven correct by physics itself. Ethan stepped out, lifted the hood carefully, and froze for half a second. The engine was old but not original, yet the mount points holding it in place were custom welded. Whoever changed the engine had kept older brackets underneath instead of removing them. No ordinary junk rebuild did that. He asked the clerk for permission, received a shrug, then tightened a loose battery connection by hand, adjusted one cable, and tried again. This time the engine coughed once, then again, then unexpectedly caught for 2 rough seconds before dying. The laughter softened. Ethan repeated the process, held the throttle lightly, and the engine came alive with a rough, uneven growl that sounded far deeper than the visible condition suggested. Not healthy, but alive. Several heads turned now for a different reason. Vanessa's expression lost some amusement. Ethan eased into the seat and tested the clutch. Stiff, but responsive. He drove the car forward 3 feet before the engine nearly stalled, corrected, then guided it slowly toward the exit, while gravel snapped beneath weak tires. The men who laughed moved aside. Lily climbed carefully into the passenger seat, looking both frightened and delighted. As they rolled toward the gate, Vanessa called out, "When it stops moving in 10 minutes, don't leave it outside my property." Ethan looked at her through the open window for the first time since paying. "If it stops, I'll still know what I paid for." She frowned slightly because his tone suggested meaning she had not caught. The drive home lasted 19 stressful minutes across side roads because the engine coughed every 3rd block and the brakes pulled left hard enough to demand constant correction. Twice Ethan considered pulling over, but each time the coupe recovered just enough to continue. Lily sat silently at first, then finally asked, "Why this one?" Ethan watched the road, listening more than driving. Hear that vibration? The shaking. The pattern under it. She listened harder. Children often heard things adults ignored when asked correctly. "It sounds stronger when you stop pressing." Ethan nodded. Exactly. The hidden note beneath the rough engine was what had made him buy it. The frame carried tension too stable for a dead shell. Something underneath this ugly body had once been built properly. At home, neighbors watched from porches as Ethan parked the coupe beside his narrow garage. Mrs. Porter next door leaned over her railing and asked the question everyone asked with kinder wording than Vanessa's. "That thing safe?" Ethan smiled faintly. "We'll find out." After dinner, while Lily finished homework upstairs, Ethan returned to the garage with one hanging bulb, a flashlight, and old tools inherited from a father whose face he remembered less clearly each year. The coupe sat in silence, now engine ticking as heat faded. He began slowly. Hood first. Replacement engine confirmed, cheap rebuild from another model, but installed unusually clean. Front frame rails carried old reinforcement plates hidden beneath paint. Rear suspension bolts were wrong generation entirely. He crawled lower, wiped dirt from the undercarriage, and found hand-cut welding lines too precise for ordinary salvage work. His pulse changed. He had seen welds like this before, not in public garages, but years ago in a desert workshop outside Nevada where race engineers treated metal like language. Ethan had been 20, then temporary labor invisible enough to overhear names nobody wrote down. He remembered one engineer saying, "Real work never leaves signatures where investors can see them." Yet this car carried signatures everywhere if you knew where to look. Midnight came quietly. Lily appeared in the doorway holding 2 mugs of weak tea because she had learned grief made her father forget time after dark. "You found something?" she asked. Ethan sat back on the concrete floor, flashlight under his arm. "Maybe someone rebuilt this carefully." She crouched beside him, small fingers brushing dust from the dashboard edge. "Mom would say it still looks ugly." Ethan smiled despite himself. "Your mom once bought a lamp missing half its shade because she said ugly things usually survive longer." Lily laughed softly, then leaned into him while he studied the steering column again. That was when he saw it beneath years of dirt near the ignition housing, barely visible under peeling plastic, a faint engraved mark. He wiped gently with his thumb. 3 lines crossing a circle. His hand stopped completely. The tea mug slipped slightly in Lily's hand. Dad. But Ethan no longer heard the room the same way. The mark hit memory like a locked door opening without warning. One hidden garage, one unfinished chassis under tarp, one engineer snapping at him not to touch anything marked with that symbol. He leaned closer, breathing slower now, and removed 2 screws holding the lower panel. Beneath it, behind the wiring, another detail-weighted metal file deliberately to hide a plate underneath. Someone had wanted this car to look worthless. Someone had hidden the one thing that would make the right eyes stop instantly. Lily whispered, "Is that bad?" Ethan stared at the symbol voice low enough that even he barely heard it. "No," he said. "It means this car was never supposed to end up in a junkyard." Upstairs, the old house creaked under night wind, ordinary and tired. But inside the garage, beside rust dust and a machine bought for $100, while strangers laughed, something buried decades earlier had just begun to wake. Ethan Carter did not sleep that night. The old coupe sat inside his narrow garage like a ghost dragged in from another decade, its faded shell catching the weak yellow light from the single bulb overhead, while Lily slept in the small room upstairs, unaware that her father had spent the last 4 hours with a flashlight, gloves, and a growing silence that felt heavier each minute. The symbol beneath the steering column had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. It was not just familiar, it belonged to a part of his life he had buried so deeply that even hearing certain engine sounds on television sometimes made his chest tighten. 20 years earlier, before marriage, before grief, before factory shifts and unpaid bills, Ethan had spent 6 months inside a private race workshop outside Nevada, hired unofficially through a mechanic who owed his uncle a favor. He had been young, invisible, useful only because he understood machine balance better than older men twice his age. He remembered hidden projects there, cars with no logos, prototypes, never photographed, engines covered whenever visitors entered. And on one unfinished chassis under a tarp, no one was supposed to touch. He had seen that exact engraving, 3 lines crossing a circle. The mark had belonged to a secret engineering division tied to Marcus Vale's early racing era, whispered about like myth, because half the prototypes built there were said to have disappeared after a scandal no one publicly explained. Back then, Ethan had been told one sentence by a senior engineer: "If you ever see that symbol again, it means someone failed very hard to erase history." At 2 in the morning, he removed the cracked dashboard panel carefully, his hands steady despite the pounding in his chest. Underneath the dust and brittle wiring sat a serial plate, but it had been filed down intentionally, not fully erased, just damaged enough to discourage curiosity. He angled the flashlight sideways and saw faint digits beneath the scratches. Partial numbers. Wrong sequence for the visible body model. Wrong decade, too. He photographed everything. At dawn, he brewed weak coffee, uploaded 3 images to an old automotive forum he had not visited in years, and wrote only one sentence. Anyone recognize this chassis stamp found in a junk lot coupe? No bragging, no mention of price, no location. Then he left to make breakfast for Lily, assuming maybe a few retired mechanics would answer by afternoon. He was wrong. By the time he returned after taking Lily to school, the forum thread had exploded. Hundreds of comments. New replies every few seconds. Half disbelief, half accusation. Fake stamp. Impossible. Whoever owns this is trolling. That weld pattern, wait. No way that tunnel reinforcement survived. Ethan scrolled, reading faster. Then one reply appeared from an account with no profile image and no public posts. Post rear suspension mount immediately. If authentic, do not sell. Another user answered beneath it. If this is what I think it is, delete location now. Ethan's phone vibrated before he could respond. Unknown number. He ignored it. Another call, then another. By noon, a local collector named Bernard Klein arrived at the garage without invitation, stepping out of a black pickup wearing mirrored sunglasses and too much confidence. "Heard you found scrap worth checking," he said, smiling like a man who already expected profit. Ethan asked how he got the address. Bernard simply lifted his phone. "Internet works fast." He circled the coupe, slowly crouched near the rear axle, then straightened with less confidence than before. "I'll give you 10 grand right now." Ethan almost laughed because $10,000 sounded absurd for a car he bought for 100. But Bernard's voice had changed. No mockery now. Serious. Hungry. Ethan shook his head. "Not for sale." Bernard removed his glasses. "You don't understand what people are already asking online." "Neither do you," Ethan replied. Bernard left irritated, but 2 hours later another buyer arrived. Then another. By evening, someone offered $50,000 without even opening the hood. Lily came home from school and found 2 men outside photographing the garage door. Ethan pulled her inside immediately and shut everything down. He stopped answering calls, but Vanessa Hale did not stop calling him. Her number flashed 9 times before he finally answered near sunset. Her voice carried none of yesterday's laughter. "Mr. Carter, I think there's been some misunderstanding about that vehicle." Ethan leaned against the garage wall, eyes on the coupe. "Which misunderstanding?" "The misunderstanding where I sold something underpriced because my inventory clerk made an error. You set the price yourself." Silence, then smoother again. "I'm willing to buy it back. 5,000. Ethan almost smiled. Yesterday it was junk. Yesterday I had no reason to inspect hidden components. Today I do. Not for sale." Her tone sharpened. 10,000. Ethan ended the call. 10 minutes later, a message arrived, $25,000. Tonight. Cash. He ignored that too. Instead, he returned to the forum and uploaded a rear suspension image as requested. The reaction became immediate chaos. One expert identified a titanium brace no public production model had ever used in that era. Another pointed out hand-cut reinforcement around the engine cradle unique to early high-speed endurance builds. Someone posted a blurred old magazine scan from 1994 showing Marcus Vale standing beside a prototype under a tarp, only one wheel visible, but the wheel pattern matched Ethan's car exactly. Then the anonymous account returned, "Check firewall behind insulation. If there is a handwritten mark, stop posting publicly." Ethan removed insulation carefully with trembling fingers. Beneath hardened adhesive sat black marker writing faded by decades, MV-01 test shell / never released. He stared so long, he forgot to breathe. Lily stood in the doorway, school backpack still on her shoulder. "Dad." He turned too fast, forcing calm. She stepped closer, reading his face the way children read storms before adults admit weather is changing. "Is it bad?" she asked. Ethan knelt beside her. "No. Maybe important. Like expensive important." He hesitated. "Maybe. Then why do you look scared?" Because he understood something nobody else online seemed to realize. Yet if this truly was MV-01, then the visible body meant nothing. The engine had been swapped long ago, yes, but the shell itself belonged to the first lost experimental chassis linked to Marcus Vale before his championship years, before corporate sponsorship, before one notorious factory fire erased several development records overnight. That prototype had vanished from history entirely. Some said destroyed. Some said stolen. Some said hidden because its performance data exposed sabotage within a rival manufacturer. Ethan remembered old mechanics whispering that one prototype had contained modifications so advanced they were years ahead of regulations, which meant collectors would not just pay, they would fight. By midnight, automotive news pages had reposted screenshots from the forum. Headlines appeared, "Possible lost. Marcus Vale. Prototype found in rural garage. $100 junkyard car could be racing artifact." Followers multiplied. Local reporters began calling neighbors. One drone hovered outside briefly until Ethan shut the garage lights off completely. The next morning, Vanessa arrived in person. No heels this time. Flat shoes, sunglasses, black SUV. She entered without waiting to be invited, staring at the coupe as though seeing an entirely different object from the one she mocked 24 hours earlier. "Name your number," she said. Ethan folded his arms. "Still junk, remember?" She exhaled. 50,000. No, 100,000. Lily, seated nearby, coloring at a workbench, looked up because even she understood that number. Vanessa noticed the child and lowered her voice. "You have no idea what happens once bigger people arrive." Ethan met her gaze. "Then why are you here before them?" For the first time, Vanessa lost her practiced composure. "Because if this becomes public, people will ask where it came from. And my dealership bought that lot from an estate I haven't fully reviewed yet." Ethan heard the sentence beneath the sentence. She was worried. About paperwork. About history. About something deeper. Before he could answer, another engine sound rolled up outside, low-controlled, expensive. Not one car. 3. Black vehicles stopping together. Men stepped out. Not collectors this time. Professional, silent, tailored. One approached the garage door and handed Ethan a single envelope. No business card, no introduction. Inside was one sheet of paper with 6 typed words, "Do not sell before noon tomorrow." At the bottom, Marcus Vale would like to see it first. Ethan read it twice, then looked toward the road where the vehicles were already leaving. Vanessa had gone pale. Truly pale this time. "That's impossible," she whispered. Ethan looked at her carefully. "You know him?" She did not answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the paper. By dawn the next day, online estimates had crossed $1 million. By 10 a.m., an auction broker offered $2.3 million over encrypted email without inspection. By 11:03, media vans parked near the corner. And at exactly 11:57, while Lily pressed her face to the upstairs window and Ethan stood inside the half-open garage with grease still on his hands, a silver vintage roadster rolled quietly to the curb. No security convoy now. No assistance. Just one man stepping out slowly, older than in the posters. Hair silvered, posture calm. Presence unmistakable even before he removed his sunglasses. Marcus Vale had arrived himself. Marcus Vale stepped out of the silver roadster with the quiet certainty of a man who no longer needed introductions. Yet the entire street changed the moment his shoes touched the pavement. Even the reporters gathered near the corner seemed to sense something historic had arrived before they fully recognized him. He wore a dark jacket with no logos, simple black gloves, and the kind of calm expression that belonged to someone who had spent decades mastering speed so completely that ordinary urgency no longer affected him. Ethan stood motionless inside the half-open garage, one hand still resting on the old coupe's roof, while Lily watched from behind him, eyes wide, because even she understood from Vanessa's face that this visitor mattered in a way the others had not. Vanessa Hale, who until yesterday had spoken like every outcome in the world could be negotiated through confidence, looked suddenly uncertain, her shoulders stiff, her polished composure cracked by something dangerously close to fear. Marcus did not greet anyone immediately. He simply looked at the car, long enough that the silence became its own pressure. His gaze moved across the cracked windshield, the patched rear quarter panel, the rust near the wheel arch, then down to the hand-welded reinforcement Ethan had uncovered the night before. He stepped closer and stopped beside the driver's side door. His gloved fingers touched the edge of the roof lightly, almost respectfully. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than Ethan expected, roughened by age but precise. "I thought this shell died in Arizona." Ethan said nothing. Marcus crouched near the front wheel, studying the suspension angle, then glanced beneath the bumper where the custom cross-brace remained half hidden under dirt. A faint smile appeared, not joy, not amusement, Something more like disbelief finally surrendering to fact. They changed the engine, Marcus murmured, and the rear mount. He looked at Ethan for the first time. Who found the firewall marking? I did, Ethan answered. Marcus nodded once as if confirming a suspicion. Then you knew enough not to strip it. Ethan held his gaze, enough to know it was built by people who didn't sign public contracts. That answer changed Marcus's expression. Something sharpened their recognition, perhaps. You worked around race engineering. A long time ago. Marcus stood again slowly and walked to the front of the car. Lily had stepped closer now, holding a rag in one hand. Marcus noticed her immediately and softened in a way he had not for the adults. You helped clean it, he asked. Lily nodded. Mostly the dashboard. Marcus gave the smallest smile. Then you touched history before half the world knew it still existed. Vanessa finally spoke, unable to remain silent any longer. Mr. Vale, if this vehicle is authentic, there are legal ownership issues that need review before Marcus raised one hand without looking at her and she stopped mid-sentence. Not rudely, effortlessly. Miss Hale, he said, still studying the car 5 minutes ago, you wanted it buried under paperwork. Now you want procedure. Vanessa's face tightened. My family purchased the estate where that lot came from. Marcus turned toward her fully now. Your father purchased that estate 15 years ago, but this chassis entered that estate long before he signed anything. Ethan noticed the subtle change in Vanessa's breathing. She knew more than she had admitted. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded photograph old enough that the edges had faded yellow. He handed it to Ethan. In the photo taken decades earlier inside a private workshop, a younger Marcus stood beside 3 engineers and a partially covered frame. Only one corner of the vehicle showed, but the wheel pattern matched perfectly. On the back was handwritten text MV-01 before Nevada testing /shell only /no public record. Ethan looked from the photo to the car, then back again. Why hide it? Marcus stared at the coupe for a moment before answering. Because it was never supposed to survive the sabotage. That word landed hard. Even Vanessa looked startled. Marcus continued, voice still controlled, but carrying old weight now. In 1994, before my first championship season, my development team built 2 shells beyond regulation, lighter, stronger, impossible to approve legally at the time. One was meant for testing only. One was meant for official adaptation later. During winter trials, someone sold technical details to a rival manufacturer. A fire destroyed one workshop. Data disappeared. 3 engineers signed silence agreements and vanished into ordinary lives. This shell disappeared before investigators arrived. Ethan's eyes narrowed. And you think this is that shell? Marcus looked at the firewall marking Ethan had uncovered. No, he said quietly. I know it is. Reporters near the street had begun aiming lenses from a distance, but none dared interrupt. Marcus opened the driver's side door and sat inside with visible care as if entering memory rather than metal. His hands settled on the wheel. For 3 full seconds he said nothing. Then he closed his eyes briefly. They kept my steering angle exactly wrong, he said almost to himself. I told them it would overcorrect under pressure. Ethan noticed it then, the old racer's left thumb tracing the wheel edge unconsciously like muscle memory surviving decades. Marcus opened his eyes again. The first time I drove this shell, we reached speeds no sponsor believed possible. The second time the brakes failed because someone loosened rear pressure lines before dawn testing. Lily looked at Ethan. Someone tried to hurt him, Marcus answered before Ethan could. Someone tried to make sure I never raced again. Vanessa folded her arms, defensive now, but visibly shaken. If this really was hidden because of sabotage, why didn't anyone tell the truth? Marcus stood and faced her directly. Because the company protecting the scandal owned too many newspapers, too many contracts, and too many futures. and because one of the men who helped hide the shell later sold it quietly to someone he trusted not to destroy it. Vanessa's voice dropped. My father, Marcus, did not answer immediately. That silence was answer enough. Vanessa looked away first. Ethan could see calculation collapsing inside her, the realization that what she mocked in public had been tied to her own family history all along. A black sedan arrived, then followed by another, and two men in tailored suits approached carrying tablets, valuation documents, and the unmistakable seriousness of people used to moving impossible sums of money discreetly. Marcus barely acknowledged them. One handed him a folder. He did not open it. Instead, he looked at Ethan. Every collector in 3 countries now wants this shell, half because of what it is, half because they think hidden documents may still be inside it. Ethan said nothing. Marcus stepped closer. There are no hidden documents. I know because we never trusted paper, but the shell itself matters enough. One of the suited men finally spoke. Current private estimate exceeds 4.2 million before restoration. Vanessa inhaled sharply. Lily looked up at her father, confused by numbers that had become unreal. Marcus took off one glove. I'm offering 5 million. The street seemed to lose sound for a second. Even reporters stopped moving. Ethan did not react outwardly, but inside him something collided. Rent debt. Lily's school fees, the leaking roof upstairs, years of counting coins, years of saying maybe next month to everything that mattered. 5 million could erase every fear he had carried since his wife died. Yet he still asked the only question that mattered to him. Why that much? Marcus answered instantly. Because this shell was supposed to vanish. Because men built it who were erased from their own work. Because whoever found it and didn't gut it for parts understood enough to protect what remained. Ethan looked at the car. Rusted metal, cracked seat foam, missing engine integrity. And yet somehow it now held entire decades inside it. And if I refuse, Marcus's expression softened, unexpectedly respectful. Then I leave my card and return when you're ready. Vanessa suddenly stepped forward. This can't happen privately. If my father's name is tied to hidden assets. Marcus turned to her. Your father did one honest thing near the end of his life. He kept this shell off the books because he knew who wanted it gone. Vanessa froze. Marcus lowered his voice. Whatever else he did, Miss Hale, he protected this. For the first time since Ethan met her, Vanessa looked less like a woman protecting reputation and more like a daughter confronting something unfinished. Marcus signaled one of his men, who opened a tablet and displayed transfer authorization already prepared. $5 million. Immediate. Verified. Ethan stared at the screen, but still did not answer. Lily tugged his sleeve gently. Dad. He crouched to her level. What do you think? She looked at the car, then at Marcus, then at the tiny apartment window above the garage. Will it go somewhere? People take care of it? Marcus answered softly. A museum first, then a private preservation garage. And her name goes beside yours if she wants. She helped save it, too. Lily looked at Ethan. Then Mom would say yes. That sentence hit harder than the money. Ethan stood slowly. He looked at Marcus. One condition. Marcus waited. The 3 engineers who built it, if any are alive, their names go with the display. Marcus held his gaze, and for the first time something emotional moved visibly across the old champion's face. Done. Ethan signed. The transfer happened there inside the garage, where rust still smelled stronger than wealth. Vanessa stepped back as if history itself had shifted beneath her shoes. But before Marcus left, he reached once more into the driver's side compartment Ethan had left open and removed something tiny, wedged behind cracked insulation, a narrow brass tag hidden deeper than Ethan had reached. He looked at it, then handed it silently to Ethan. The engraving read, Test Driver Backup Authorization, E. Carter Sr. Ethan stared, breath stopping entirely now because that was his father's name. His estranged father dead 12 years, the man who had disappeared from his childhood without explanation. Marcus saw recognition land in Ethan's face and spoke quietly enough that only he heard it. "Your father drove this shell once after the sabotage. That's why I came myself." The garage felt strangely quiet after the contracts were signed, as if the old coupe had carried away not only decades of hidden history, but also the storm that had gathered around Ethan Carter's life in less than a week. By late afternoon, Marcus Vale's transport team carefully loaded the rusted shell onto a covered trailer, with the kind of precision usually reserved for priceless artwork. Yet Ethan still stood beside it until the doors closed, one hand resting for a final second on the cold metal near the driver's side frame. Lily stood beside him, holding the brass tag Marcus had found, tracing the engraved letters again and again, as though touching something impossible might help it become real. E. Carter, Sr. The name had unsettled Ethan more than the $5 million ever could. His father had left when Ethan was 9, carrying silence where explanations should have been leaving behind only a toolbox, unpaid bills, and a mother who never once spoke his name without pain. Ethan had built adulthood around the belief that some absences were simple, some men just walked away. But now that small brass tag sat in his daughter's hand like proof that the story had always been larger than he had known. Marcus had stayed after the paperwork, leaning quietly against his roadster, while reporters remained blocked outside by temporary security. He told Ethan the rest, without ceremony. Years ago, after the sabotage scandal, Marcus had needed one trusted backup driver willing to test a damaged prototype off-record, because too many names inside the official circuit had already been compromised. Ethan's father, Daniel Carter, had been a freelance mechanic with exceptional reflexes and no interest in fame. He drove the shell once through a desert track under another name, confirmed the steering flaw, then disappeared from the project before contracts were signed because someone warned him the prototype had become dangerous for anyone attached to it. He didn't leave because he lacked skill, Marcus had said quietly. He left because he understood when powerful people were beginning to panic. Ethan had asked why no one ever contacted the family. Marcus answered with painful honesty. By the time I looked for him years later, he had already vanished into ordinary life. Now, as evening settled over the street and the trailer disappeared, Ethan returned upstairs with Lily carrying not victory, but a strange tenderness he did not know how to name. The apartment looked the same: peeling kitchen paint, uneven floorboards, one broken cabinet hinge, but for the first time in years he no longer looked at every object through the lens of what needed delaying until next month. Lily sat at the small table while he opened an old wooden box where his mother's remaining photographs had been stored, untouched for years. He searched until he found one image taken before he was born. A younger woman smiling beside a thin man leaning against a garage wall, half his face shadowed, one hand resting on a steering wheel just barely visible at the frame's edge. Lily leaned closer. "That's Grandpa." Ethan nodded slowly. "I think I'm meeting him for the first time, too." 2 weeks later, the money had already changed. Practical things, rent paid, years ahead. Lily enrolled in the Science Academy. She had once only whispered about medical appointments booked without delay, but Ethan refused every luxury suggestion sent by financial advisors Marcus's office offered. Instead, he rented an abandoned repair space near the edge of town and reopened it under one name, Only Carter Garage. Not for profit, first, for memory. On opening day, Marcus arrived without cameras and brought a framed museum photograph of the restored shell. Beneath it, exactly as promised, 4 names were listed: the 3 forgotten engineers and Daniel Carter, test driver. Ethan stood looking at the frame for a long time before hanging it above the main workbench. Vanessa Hale came later that week, dressed simply this time, carrying old estate papers her father had left hidden in a sealed file. She apologized without performance, quietly, almost awkwardly admitting she had spent years learning business from polished surfaces and had nearly missed the one truth sitting in rust before her eyes. Ethan accepted the apology because bitterness suddenly felt too expensive to keep. That evening, after everyone left, Lily sat on the workshop floor doing homework while soft rain tapped the roof. Ethan closed the garage doors, turned off the main lights, and looked once more at the framed brass tag Marcus had mounted beside the photo. For years, he had believed life gave certain people only leftovers, used, chances, damaged beginnings, cheap things nobody respected. Yet $100 had led him not only to security, but to a father's hidden courage, a daughter's brighter future, and a truth buried beneath rust, long enough to matter when finally found. Lily looked up and smiled. Dad. Yeah, you still buy broken things better than anyone. Ethan smiled for the first time that day, hearing rain tools and his daughter's voice filling a room that no longer felt temporary. Outside, the street stayed ordinary. Inside, for the first time in years, nothing in his life felt lost anymore.